So Russia just sent some military drones into Poland, and by the looks of it, this was not accidental. We can tell that by looking at the flight path that the drones took, as well as how deeply these drones penetrated into Poland. We can also tell that by looking at how some of these drones circled around in Belarus before entering Poland, showing that this wasn't just the result of some accidental jamming that just caused these drones to kind of wander over the Polish border. And because of all of these details, a lot of people have already asked me, even though this just happened yesterday, why I think it happened. Why do I think that Russia would provoke Poland, a NATO country, and what can Russia actually get out of it, and what is Russia's plan? As it turns out, I think I have some answers. And I actually believe in these answers with a very high degree of confidence. Of course, we can never be certain, but as close to certain as I can be, I believe I can tell you exactly why Russia made this incursion, and I believe that reason is a lot different from what a lot of people might be thinking. And I will give you that answer succinctly, and then I will defend it throughout the video. And the answer is that I think that Russia is making very intentional moves with this incursion, but also with other incursions like it, to distract NATO military efforts, and specifically NATO military resources, away from the front line in Ukraine. Russia believes that if they make small threats against NATO countries, they can get these countries to be afraid and therefore to dedicate more of their resources to defending their own home country against an invasion and against an attack that almost certainly is never coming. And Russia does that because it knows that if there are military resources tied up within Poland or within Germany or within any other NATO country, those military resources are basically worthless because they're not on the front lines in Ukraine, the war that Russia actually cares about fighting today. Now, as you can see, this answer is a big one, and it has huge implications. It has huge implications for Poland, and it has huge implications for every other NATO country within Europe. Nevertheless, I think this answer is maybe the only one that actually makes sense, and you can arrive at this answer in several different ways. First of all, by doing a common sense analysis of what Russia could actually gain from this kind of incursion, and working backwards, and this is really the only thing that you will find. But second of all, you can arrive at this answer because it matches historical precedent. And when you look across everything that Russia has done to Europe throughout the entire war in Ukraine, you will see a similar pattern. This is a big deal because it means that a lot of countries are potentially falling for Russia's bait and playing into Russia's hand by doing exactly what Russia wants them to do in response to small incursions like this one. So first, the common sense analysis. What could Russia actually gain from actions like what they just did yesterday? And obviously, they can't gain anything of military value. Their goal was obviously not to actually attack any targets within Poland, because the force was just too small. Russia couldn't do anything meaningful, and if they did, they would provoke a massive response. And so when you look at what Russia is doing, you have to look at what kind of a reaction are they trying to create. There have been a lot of theories that have said Russia did this and other things like it just to probe and test and kind of see how NATO would respond. And I actually completely disagree with that. I understand where people are coming from, but I don't actually think it makes sense. Because if Russia did not already know how NATO would respond, they would never send drones into a NATO country. Long story short, Russia's military cannot even handle the war in Ukraine. At this particular moment, they absolutely cannot handle a war against NATO. And so if Russia thinks that NATO will respond with any kind of force to a legitimate provocation from Russia, it is silly for Russia to make or even risk that provocation because it can result in their utter destruction. I think Russia already knows exactly how NATO will respond because they have seen how NATO has responded over several years of the war in Ukraine, and they know that NATO's response to these drones will basically be nothing. And so Russia isn't sending these types of drones to provoke a NATO response. They are sending these types of drones because they know ahead of time through experience that there will be no significant NATO response. A little sidebar here turns out to be very important because it shows how these drone incursions actually undermine a whole lot of Russia's propaganda campaigns, and also helps us understand why Russia is doing it. Because for years, Russia has said that NATO is just this extremely aggressive alliance. NATO is looking for any excuse they can find to attack Russia, And Russia has said that this is basically one of the reasons why they have invaded Ukraine. And yet, if Russia truly believed that NATO was so aggressive as they say, they would never send drones to make incursions on NATO territory. Because they know that if NATO was as aggressive as they say, NATO would use those drone incursions as a legitimate reason to trigger Article 5 and go in and destroy Russia. Russia obviously knows that that is not what NATO is going to do, as I've already said. And so if Russia knows that they are not going to get NATO to respond against them militarily by sending drones into Poland, what kind of a response are they trying to provoke? I would say that Russia's goals, rather than potentially provoking NATO military action against them, are quite the opposite. Russia wants to do everything they can to take military pressure off them where it actually matters, which is on the battlefield in Ukraine, where Russia's strategies continue to fail in large part because of NATO military supplies. And even if NATO isn't supplying a lot of weapons today, Russia wants to keep that trend going. Russia knows that if Ukraine actually gets a large influx of weapons from NATO countries, Russia will absolutely lose the war. And so Russia does things to prevent that from happening. We've seen that, for example, in the propaganda campaigns that Russia has been waging throughout the entire war, largely among NATO countries. They've been very successful there. And we should actually see this as a guiding principle for everything else that Russia does within NATO countries, whether those are sabotage attacks or drone incursions or anything of the sort. For example, with a drone incursion of literally just a couple Russian drones going into Polish airspace, I can almost guarantee you that in the public conversations in Poland and Germany, people are going to be demanding a lot more air defense because they are so afraid. And that will mean Poland and Germany keeping more air defense systems for themselves and giving less air defense systems over to Ukraine. Right now, air defense systems are the number one thing Ukraine needs because Russia is shifting to a war strategy that primarily consists of long-range strikes. And so by making Ukraine's partners afraid that these long-range strikes could actually affect them, Russia can, again, keep military support from actually going where it is needed today on the battlefield. Now, the reason I'm saying this is because it's not the first time it's happened. Earlier on in the war, when, for example, other NATO countries were giving Ukraine a lot of tanks and armored vehicles, Russia decided to all of a sudden start building new military bases along their borders with NATO countries. And these were bases that could theoretically hold a lot of tanks and a lot of Russian soldiers. As it turned out, though, these bases were basically just shells. They didn't actually house a lot of soldiers. They didn't actually house a lot of tanks. They just had the theoretical ability to do so. But by doing this, it made a lot of people in NATO countries scared that Russia might be preparing to actually attack them. And this caused the public conversations in these countries to turn in a way that was skewed towards a little bit less support for Ukraine today, a little bit more military equipment held in reserve in case we need it in the future. And what we see is very asymmetric warfare by Russia, where Russia can invest a very, very small number of resources, basically no resources at all, and effectively eliminate a lot of Ukraine's military equipment, not by destroying it on the battlefield, but by preventing it from getting to Ukraine in the first place. This is very important to pay attention to because while Russia's military performance has been subpar, a lot owing to corruption and deception and things like that within the Russian military, that same corruption and that same deception means that Russia is exceptionally good at something else. They are very good at information war. They are very good at propaganda. They are very good at knowing how certain isolated events alter the public consciousness in a way that is favorable to them. With that in mind, it is very important to talk about the war in Ukraine with a sense of reality. And it's especially important to talk about Russia potentially opening up the war in Ukraine to attack other targets with a sense of reality. Russia currently is not being able to move forward the front lines in Ukraine. Just Ukraine is currently holding Russia at bay. And so it is exceedingly unlikely, I think something we can almost just write off completely, that Russia will actually attack a NATO country at any point in the near future. Now, would Russia attack a NATO country if they could? Of course they would. They have shown that they have no compunctions about invading any country so long as they think they can win. But that is the key factor. Russia will not attack NATO anytime soon because they cannot attack NATO without destroying themselves. Russia will, though, feign that they might attack NATO in order to keep NATO from intervening in the war that they are currently fighting that they actually want to win. What we see right now in the world is a lot of countries who are extremely powerful with yesterday's technology, stockpiling that technology because they are afraid they might have to fight a war in the future. And they are not using that technology on the battlefield where it could actually be effective today because of something that may or may not even happen tomorrow. That said, there's another factor here that is very, very important to understand. And if there's any national leader watching this, I really want you to think about this. In the war in Ukraine, technology is developing very, very rapidly. We have drone warfare, we have AI weapons, we have advanced robotics. All of these things are being developed as we speak. And all of these things have already been proven to make the technology of yesterday, like tanks and armored vehicles, a whole lot less effective than we thought they would be. And so with every day that weapons sit in stockpiles, there grows a chance that those weapons will just ultimately end up rusting. Because at the point that they are finally used, they will be completely irrelevant, and they will be considered too dangerous to the soldiers who operate them to even use them. What we are experiencing right now is a technological shift in warfare that is changing warfare in a way very similar to how warfare changed in World War I, where prior to World War I, people were fighting with cavalry, and people were even still using swords in combat in many cases. And in World War I, people went into combat with those tactics and they lost, and they had to adjust very quickly. Any country that stockpiled a bunch of horses, a bunch of cavalry, a bunch of swords, would find that those weapons were useless. They were only useful as museum pieces. And what we see now is a lot of countries stockpiling what could turn out to be largely museum pieces because they are afraid of fighting a war in the future where they might be outclassed if it actually happens. That is a sobering thought, but it doesn't have to be that way. Today, these weapons still have quite a bit of value. It's already been reduced quite a bit, but they still retain quite a bit of that value. And the war in the future can be avoided if people realize what Russia is actually trying to do. When Russia tries to prevent NATO weapons from going to Ukraine, whatever tactics they use, they reveal that they are deathly afraid of that very outcome. And so what NATO should do is not listen to Russia, but call Russia's bluff. Send Ukraine the weapons that are still functional today as a mechanism to avoid the war of tomorrow. Russia will not attack a NATO country while they are still fully engaged in their war against Ukraine. In fact, they can't. And people need to realize this. In particular, politicians need to realize this and stop being so afraid and actually take actions. And people need to realize in Europe, in my opinion, I know I'm an American, but I still think this rings true. People in Europe need to realize that an investment in Ukraine's defense is not only the same as an investment in their own defense, but it's actually more effective than an investment in their own defense. Giving Ukraine anti-aircraft missiles today to fire against the actual drones and missiles that are crossing into Ukrainian territory today is an infinitely better investment than having those missiles sit somewhere in Germany or in Poland or in a warehouse somewhere else to fire against a theoretical target that is probably never actually coming. Russia, though, knows that Europe does not currently think like this. Russia knows that Europe thinks with a very fragmented mindset. They are not thinking in terms of collective defense. They are all thinking in terms of their own individual country. And Russia is seeking to promote this as much as possible, because the more people are thinking about their own defense instead of Ukraine's defense, as if the two are separate, which they're not, the more Russia wins. Russia's goal is to keep us all divided. Because on our own, Russia might look like a really, really big opponent. But united, Russia absolutely does not stand a chance, and they would lose very quickly against a united, free, democratic world. Thank you for watching this far in the video. If you've watched this far, I hope it's not presumptuous to say that you probably got something of value out of this, or at the least found this information very interesting. If that's the case, could you please support this channel by liking this video and subscribing to the channel? Both of those things just take a second and they're completely free, but they help me out a lot. And if you want to support the channel even more, there's a number of links in the description by which you can do so. Consider becoming a patron or a YouTube channel member today. Thank you guys so much for those who support me. It really does help out a lot, and it helps keep these videos coming at a consistent pace.